Okay. Hopefully everyone can hear. So I think I'm gonna. Can you hear up the back there? All right. Good. Okay. So anyway, let's get going. Welcome everyone to the distinguished visiting lecture series, lecture today with Dr. McGorry, and also have a happy election day to you all, and I hope it is happy for us. So, but don't forget to vote. So. But anyway, just by way of introduction of myself, I'm Andrew Goddard. I'm a professor of psychiatry up at the Fresno campus, and the reason I'm here is I'm Dr. McGorry. Professor McGorry is from my alma mater, University of Melbourne in Australia, and so it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce him today. And as I was graduating from medical school, he was founding his early psychosis program in Melbourne. So we kind of we weren't working together, but it was a very, I guess, seminal time for psychiatry in Australia with early psychosis. And anyway, Dr. McGorry is executive director of the Orygen program. He's professor of youth mental health at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and director of the board of the National Youth Mental Health Foundation, aka Headspace. I guess that's the pet name, Headspace. He's a world-leading researcher in the area of early psychosis and youth mental health, and has a strong interest in promoting the and a promoter of health needs of the homeless, refugees, and asylum seekers, of which there are very many in Australia and Australasia. His work has been critical and seminal in the development of safe, effective treatments and innovative research into the needs of young people with emerging mental disorders, especially psychosis and severe bipolar and mood disorders. He's also played a major role in the transformation of mental health services to better meet the needs of vulnerable young people. Professor McGorry was a key architect of the headspace model, and I can't really articulate that, but he will say more about that, and has been a successful advocate for the expansion of that model on a national basis, and I think even international basis. He has successfully advocated for the establishment of early psychosis programming based on the Early Psychosis Prevention and Intervention Center model, or EPIC model. So that EPIC acronym is also carried across the pond here to a number of centers. He is frequently asked to advise groups, public health groups in Australia and abroad on youth mental health policy. Dr. McGorry is heavily published in the psychiatry and clinical literature and serves as editor-in-chief of Early Intervention in Psychiatry, an Australian and international journal. He's fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and current president of the Society for Mental Health Research, and is also the president-elect of the Schizophrenia International Research Society. And in 2010, in recognition for his seminal work in youth mental health and psychosis, he was named Australian of the Year. So a tremendous honor. And so please give a very warm UCSF welcome to Dr. McGorry.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Andrew, for that very kind introduction, and great to be introduced by an Aussie. I didn't expect that, but that's really good. Well, thank you all for coming out early this morning. And what I'd like to talk to you about is, I guess, early intervention and how important it is in psychiatry, and how we can build it, how we have been building it as a real international teamwork effort, I would say, over the past 2 decades. And you know, I've just come from Milan in Italy, where we had the 10th International Early Intervention Conference. And this has been a very, very important platform internationally for, I guess, researchers, clinicians, communities getting behind this idea of early intervention. Originally, as Andrew said, it started off with early psychosis. schizophrenia and related disorders in particular, but it's definitely broadened out now to a transdiagnostic approach, and I'll try to take you through that. So we're moving forward, but we're looking back a little bit, and a few mad professors don't go to waste here, do they? So, and here's another one who unfortunately gave us a very bad diagnostic system, which didn't really help very much with early intervention. It built intrinsic pessimism into one of our major diagnoses, schizophrenia, by implying that it's impossible to get better if you've got schizophrenia. Well, that wasn't a very sensible thing to do, and it was wrong in the first place. Even despite the way it was defined, patients still managed to somehow get better, despite the bad treatment they often receive. But you know, conceptually it was a very difficult problem for us. So we had to turn last episode psychosis into first episode. That was the first thing. We had psychiatrists telling patients back in the 80s, sorry, your son's got schizophrenia, he won't get better, you know, you need to just plan for him to have a disabled life and be on welfare, and that's it. And, you know, as a result, something like 14% of people with schizophrenia in Australia work with that sort of mentality and lack of support that they have been given. So early psychosis, early intervention psychosis was a very important first battle to actually start fighting. Two of the people that began that, and it really started off in a research context. Tim Crow there on the left and John Kane from New York on the right, they started to do first episode studies in the late 70s, they weren't that focused on clinical care so much. They probably shared some of the pessimism, but they definitely were interested in studying these illnesses from the beginning, rather than looking at people in their 40s and 50s who had long-term illnesses, and very difficult to conclude much from those sort of samples. And I've been to 25 years of schizophrenia research conferences, and really not a lot has been learned from looking at these unselected, you know, chronic samples. And so this movement to the first episode focus and the early stages was very important for learning more about these illnesses, and these two gentlemen deserve a lot of credit. As Andrew said, in 1984 we set up a first episode unit in Melbourne in a quite a famous mental hospital called Royal Park, where John Cade had been the superintendent, the discoverer of lithium. So it had a good, you know, at least had a one-shot, you know, success. But as you can see, it was a pretty run-down place, and our premises were not very salubrious. But we managed to get maybe 10 or 12 young people together in the one place who were experiencing their first episode. And immediately we could see two things. First of all, we were doing them more harm than good. We were giving them way too much medication. It was the years of rapid neuroleptization, where if some is good, more is better, and the patients used to get 10 times as much antipsychotics as they really needed. And secondly, we didn't know what else to do with them. You know, we had no psychosocial treatments, no evidence-based psychosocial treatments whatsoever. And you know, they came out of this experience traumatized, shell-shocked, and really in not a very good state, even though they might have actually got rid of their psychotic symptoms. So, you know, absolutely massive amount of work to do. And, you know, we built on it for a few years, and we've managed to get some government money to build a community-based program, not just an inpatient program. And this was probably 80% of the resources then were in the community, and we set up detection teams to go and find the patients, because we'd already learned that the average patient had 1 or 2 years of florid psychosis before they actually entered treatment, which is absolutely unbelievable when you think about it. It's as if someone with a cardiac disease had to have 10 heart attacks and go into cardiac failure before they would get any treatment. That's essentially what was happening. The patients were coming in after long periods of psychosis, their lives in ruins, their parents completely frantic and often addicted to drugs and other problems. Usually it was a suicide attempt or an aggressive incident which brought the patient into care. And sadly that's still way too common around the world, that scenario. So going to find them as soon as they were starting to struggle, going to them, finding venues that they'd be happy to be assessed in, home treating them, not bringing them to the hospital if we didn't need to, and having a case management system that would look after them for the first few years after diagnosis in a consistent way, and along the way trying to develop evidence-based treatments in a psychosocial sense to complement the drug therapies. And the other thing was using a fraction of the medications that we were using before, and we were helped in that by PET studies which showed that from Satish Kapoor and others that showed that you really only needed a couple of milligrams of whatever to actually to block enough dopamine to get rid of the psychosis, and everything else was just about managing anxiety and behaviour, which could be done in other ways. So those are the sort of principles that we were starting to work with. We had some great mates there in Scandinavia, and they had the right spirit. You know, I don't know if you've seen this TV series Vikings, but it's one of my favourites. And I think to get reform going in psychiatry, you need to carry an axe with you at all times. So the Scandinavians were our best allies, I think, at first. That was an early intervention meeting in Stavanger in '95. Then in Melbourne in '96, we were lucky because we had all of our heroes from the US and other countries who had been doing this work, like Dick Wyatt and Keshavan and Jeff Lieberman. These sort of people were in Melbourne for the CINP meeting, and we managed to rope them into a big first episode meeting that we organised at the same time, and we started the International Early Psychosis Association, and this kind of brotherhood or sisterhood was very, very important to move this field forward. I'm just going to take you very quickly now through the headlines of the last sort of 20-odd years of research. I mean, it could be, you know, from the meeting in Milan, that there were 700 new pieces of scientific information in that meeting, so it's very, very complex and rich now, the scientific evidence base behind this, but this is just some of the absolutely top-level sort of things that we've learned over the last 20 years or so. We weren't responsible for the Berlin Wall, by the way, and can't claim that. First thing, treatment delay that I just talked about. The Scandinavians did a very systematic study reducing the duration of untreated psychosis in an experimental sector and then having a control sector where this was not done. And they did it with community education campaigns, they did it with mobile detection teams, and they dramatically reduced the duration of untreated psychosis from 2 years down to just a matter of weeks. And in the control sector it was substantially longer. And they did then follow the patients up for 10 years, and they found that the recovery rates were twice as good in the patients who had a shortened DUP. Now, that's hard evidence, but it's still, the recovery rates were still not good enough. They still were fairly unimpressive in some ways, even in the better recovered group. And that was because they didn't do the other thing you need to do with these first episode patients, and that's provide a stage and age specific sort of program of comprehensive care for them. They just plugged them into their standard Norwegian psychiatric system for adult psychiatry, and it just wasn't really enough to really reach the best level they could. So, but nevertheless, reducing DUP did have a long-term effect, and it's definitely worthwhile doing. The next thing that we've learned is that and if someone had told me this 20 years ago, I would have been completely amazed. We can predict and even delay the onset of psychosis, and there are people obviously in UCSF working on this very, very well. Rachel Lowy and her group with the PQ and made major contributions to this. But we now know with the criteria that we developed about 20 years ago that with this clinical phenotype, which is really subthreshold psychosis, it's patients with intermittent subthreshold positive-like symptoms. They could have a family history, they could have some just more non-specific deterioration, but the set of criteria that was developed, and which is used in the US more or less in the same way now, a meta-analysis here shows that 36% of those patients so defined will actually have progressed to a sustained psychotic illness within 3 years. And so that is a very significant enhancement of prediction compared to if you just roped in, you know, random people off the street in the age group, and it's very much, probably several hundredfold higher the increase in risk. Now, many people will point out, well, what about the other two-thirds? Two-thirds do not progress to psychosis, so you've got a bunch of false positives for psychosis there. That's been an issue for critics. But we also know that those patients are not out of the woods. They have a significant range of other problems. They have persistent mood and anxiety disorders. Many of them will persist in a subclinical way with the psychosis picture. And some will remit, some of them will do okay, and this is true. So this is what you would expect with an early stage of an illness, that there will be different outcomes. And I suppose we have got an enriched sample here for risk of various kinds, and that's the way to think about it transdiagnostically. And it's really pointed at the way to how we should approach sub-threshold work more broadly. I know most researchers are still stuck in the silo of psychosis, but I think what we've learned from this is that we can look at different pathways and different outcomes as well. And the Naples group, who've been the real leaders in North America in this space, led by Ty Cannon, they've recently published this individual risk calculator, which is really just showing that you can improve on that prediction of risk even further with some simple variables thrown into the mix, and maybe some biomarkers will help with that over time too. That's been worked on very hard. Now, to throw a bit of a spanner in the works, our friend Jim van Os in the Netherlands and his group have shown that psychotic-like symptoms are actually quite common in the general community. You know, maybe it's not so hard to believe in your election context, but 7% of the population are actually have psychotic symptoms, and it not necessarily implies a disorder being present. So what does it mean? What does a disorder actually mean? A disorder means that you're suffering, you're functionally impaired, and you are in need of some sort of help. And you know, just having isolated psychotic symptoms on their own don't seem to be enough for that. They have to have some company. They have to have some distress. They have to have you know, anxiety, depression. They have to have functional impairment or cognitive problems which are associated with functional impairment. And as we get further to the left of the screen, that's what we're seeing, and we're getting a higher predictive effect of these features of this clinical phenotype. So. And on the extreme left, you've obviously got frank psychosis, which more sustained. We'd like to look at it, as I said a minute ago, more broadly. Now, certainly there is a valence for frank psychosis from these criteria that we develop, but there's also a valence for mood and anxiety disorders, and only 7% of the patients, when followed up over a longer period of time, were sort of disease-free, if you want to put it that way, had no diagnosis over the follow-up period. So these patients need care. Usually in diagnostic systems or in healthcare systems, they're locked out of care. They're seen as not serious enough, not unwell enough to warrant, you know, coverage or access to care, which is quite amazing because their GAF scores are in the low 50s. You know, that they are really, you know, struggling, these young people, and even though they technically haven't ticked the box for DSM whatever, then they still need help. They would meet DSM criteria for other non-psychotic disorders in most cases, by the way, but they haven't met the criteria yet for a psychotic disorder. And fortunately, you know, there's been a huge effort to try to work out what to do with them. And we certainly don't think they should be given antipsychotic medications. But we have studied low-dose antipsychotics. We've studied CBT very extensively and related forms of psychological intervention. And we've studied fish oil in one quite dramatic study that Paul Lamminger led in Vienna. And if you put these studies together in a meta-analysis, as Mark Vanderkaart did a couple of years ago, there have been 2 or 3 of these now, what you see is a 50% reduction in risk for transition to first episode psychosis in these samples, which is quite significant, I think. It's been underappreciated, in my opinion, the fact that we can actually do this. If you could delay the onset of Alzheimer's by 50% for a year or 2, you'd be pretty happy with that, wouldn't you? So why aren't we deliriously happy about being able to do that for psychosis? It's interesting the way it's been interpreted. I suppose the fact that we're not curing it, you know, I don't think we can say we've cured it, but we can definitely influence the onset, and these patients, when they're in these trials, that they generally all do much better. Their functioning, their distress, all of these things do actually improve. So some of the critics that have been opposed to these sort of trials just haven't really looked at the data here. So we did a replication. It's just in press right now. It'll be published later this month in a very prominent US journal. It's a large replication, 304 subjects, from 8 or 9 different countries around the world, and unfortunately it failed to confirm the results of the first fish oil study. So that's kind of disappointing. I mean, there may still be a subgroup that do, on the basis of biomarkers and other predictors, might benefit, but we've got to say that we weren't able to replicate the first study, which was quite dramatic, the first one. We think the reason we didn't replicate it was because both groups in the replication were given very comprehensive psychosocial treatment, and that probably really helped a lot in its own right, because functioning and symptoms were much better at 6 months and 12 months, and transition rates were only 5% at 6 months, so lower than we'd ever seen before. So we think that's the most likely explanation. So it doesn't mean that the fish oil might not work, but it's not necessary if you give good psychosocial treatment. On the other hand, we can't say that we found any evidence for the fish oil working in this study. We're in the middle now, or just started a new study which is funded by NIMH, which is very unusual for NIMH to fund a study predominantly in Australia. We do have US partners, and UCSF is one of the partner sites through Rachel and her group, and also UCD, University of California, Davis, Tara Nienven and Can Carter are involved in this study too. So, and this is something that is really not, in some ways, it's not very exciting. It's there's no experimental treatments in this study. It's what it is an adaptive trial. It's trying to model what clinicians actually do in real life, but with randomized steps built into it. So a patient who's got these subthreshold psychotic symptoms comes into our headspace centres, and they're offered this trial. The first 4 to 6 weeks is just simple problem solving, support, exercise, those sort of things, and what we're trying to do there is to see if that's enough, which it often is for some of these kids who are on the threshold, who are stressed and struggling. That can actually help. If they responded, in other words, the symptoms have improved and their functioning's improved, then they go into the follow-up arm and they just get maintenance sort of support and of that type for 12 months. If they haven't responded, they get randomized to cognitive behavioral case management versus simple interventions for another 4 or 5 months. And if still they haven't responded, then they get offered randomization to an SSRI or placebo on top of the existing therapy. And that's to test the hypothesis that SSRIs might actually be neuroprotective in a sense of transition. There is some circumstantial evidence from some studies, like Barbara Kornblatt in New York and Phil McGorry in London, which suggests SSRIs might actually be helpful, not just for depression, but actually in a more wider neuroprotective way. And then we're getting pretty deep into the year now. These patients have been ill for maybe 9 or 10 or 11 months at this stage. They can choose at that point, if they're no better, to opt for fish oil, omega-3 as the next treatment, or low-dose antipsychotics. Now, we would be criticised if we offered low-dose antipsychotics earlier than that in the cycle. There'd be, and quite rightly, I think that would be very premature to be offering them earlier than that. But if the patient chooses it at that point, then we're prepared to offer it, and so that'll be more naturalistic, that part. So what we expect is, that we'll have a very good series of outcomes for these patients, because they're getting the best we already know from other studies that will work, and we expect very few transitions during this sequence of events. So that's what a SMART trial is, an adaptive trial. The next thing to say is that we know we definitely can improve outcomes in first episode psychosis and during this critical period after the first diagnosis. There's a meta-analysis from Merete Nordentoft, the Danish leader of this work, who's rolled out early psychosis programs across Denmark in recent years based on the OPUS study. And Chris Carell from New York did one as well. It's on 9 RCTs of CSC in this more specialised first episode care versus treatment as usual. This was presented in Florence at the Schizophrenia International Research Society meeting. And you can see all the major outcome variables were better in the more enhanced early psychosis program arm of the studies. The effect sizes were not dramatic; they're medium at best. And The problem is that also that if you withdraw these services too early, then some of those gains are lost. It's as if you started treating a patient with breast cancer, and they were going into remission, and they'd had 6 sessions of chemotherapy or whatever the therapy was, and suddenly you ran out of money, and you said, I'm sorry, we haven't got enough money for the rest of the chemotherapy, and we're going to kick you out. Well, that's what happens in psychiatry all the time around the world. We start to get patients better, and we have to kick them out. And even in first episode programs, which give them 2 years on average of care, there's a subgroup that need to have that built on and maintained, and yet no government is willing really to provide that longer term sort of safety net for them, which is absolutely crazy when you think about the costs they're going to bear in terms of welfare payments and foregone taxation and all these other sort of things that we know we can actually do something about. Because many of these programs now have IPS models built into them, so the vocational recovery is dramatic in these cases where that's also available. So anyway, strong evidence base, better every year in this space, and it's been given a massive shot in the arm by the RAISE study. Now, Moretta Nordentoft said, how come it took the Americans 10 years to do what we did back in the day? She said that in Milan, and I said, well, it doesn't matter, because the fact that the Americans have done it is going to have a massive influence, not just in America, but as a backwash in other parts of the world to make this actually more viable. So this is a very, very important study. It had positive results for the first episode, more specialised first episode care at 2 years, and particularly so if they had a short DUP. If the duration of untreated psychosis was shorter, they are much more responsive to these sorts of treatments, so you've got to get them early. And some of the European research wasn't as good at that. It actually didn't reduce the DUP. The OPUS study didn't reduce the DUP, so their outcome data probably could have been a lot better than it actually was. So I think we've learned a lot from these international studies. There's been great leadership in the US, in Europe, and in many parts of the world to make this happen. And of course, there's no point in just having these little boutique programs in isolated places. You've got, once you actually find something that works, or a system that works, you've got to make it available to everybody. And so the scaling up is very, very important, and we've been very bad at that in psychiatry. But this is an example of where we have done it, at least in hundreds of places. It's certainly not routine everywhere in the world, but we know that in many countries in Europe, especially the UK, Denmark, the Netherlands, in Australia finally we're doing it. In North America now, I think it's going to be in 48 states by 2018. Oregon was probably the most advanced. In California there are lots of these programs, but they're not very fidelity based. They're kind of a bit random. But that could be fixed. There's definitely money and investment in it. In Hong Kong, in Singapore, and in Korea now too. So I think the challenge is, can this be just part of the furniture? Can it be normal? Can a first episode person anywhere in the world expect access to this comprehensive evidence-based care for at least 2 to 5 years after diagnosis? Yeah, so that's the US data. In Australia, linked to headspace, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, that's happening too. And the final thing, and you'd think this would be the killer argument, but it hasn't been, because politicians, they're much more sensitive to votes than money. But we have got a great financial case, because there are 12 studies now showing that both first episode programs and these prodromal services are highly cost effective. This is from all parts of the world, these studies, including the RAISE study. So it's a lay-down misère. If you're not doing this as a government, then you're wasting money in mental health, and you're depriving other groups of patients from benefiting from the savings. So that's the aggressive way to put it. That's irresponsible not to be doing this. And this was in the Huffington Post. I don't know if you saw it last October. Must have been published in New York. But if you read it carefully, it sounds like there's a new drug being discovered. There's a miraculous new treatment for schizophrenia that could transform the way we treat mental illness. actually they're talking about this early intervention reform based on RAISE, and they interviewed Tamara Sale from Oregon about how she rolled it out across Oregon, and they got case examples from these studies. It's quite a compelling piece, and it's quite good because it's making the point, if this was a new drug, it would be scaled up dramatically. But it's not a drug, it's a way of going about care. There's obviously evidence-based components within it, but it's a system, an approach to care which is optimistic, believes in the patient, involves the patient, and expects them to have a good recovery. Okay, some of the new directions here. There's a paper published a couple of years ago from the Netherlands which showed that if you try to reduce the dose of medication in the first episode, maybe not stopping it, but maybe aiming to stop, but definitely reducing it, dose reduction. The big anxiety is that the patient will have relapses during those first couple of years, and that actually was borne out in the 2-year follow-up. There were more relapses in the patients who had a dose reduction than the ones that stayed on the maintenance dose. And so everyone was kind of a bit depressed about that in this study, but they kept following them up for another 5 years. So at 7 years they found there was no difference in the relapse rate actually by then. And the relapses were not severe anyway in the first place. But what was dramatic was the functional outcomes, the amount of work they were doing, the number of friends they had, all of that kind of stuff, social outcomes, vocational outcomes were twice as good in the group who were having the lower doses. And it wasn't, a perfect study methodologically, but it was very, very interesting. So 3 replications are being carried out of this study now, building in neuroimaging to sort of look at what the effects of lower or higher doses of drugs on the brain would be, but particularly with higher doses of psychosocial treatment in both groups to see if you can minimize the relapse risk, improve the functional outcome, and still use lower doses of medication. So it's not anti-medication, it's just trying to say we're not using these medications in a very, very sophisticated way in these patients, and we're relying too heavily on them without actually doing all the other things that the patients need. And that's a health financing issue as much as anything else. It's not blaming us as clinicians for being neglectful, it's sort of saying we're not financially supported to do all the things the patients actually need. So this is the employment focus, the IPS model applied to first episode. Incredibly effective. You can see that 80–90% of patients can actually work following a first episode, compared with 14% of chronic schizophrenia. And physical health. When you come in for your first episode of psychosis, you are by and large a physically healthy young person. 20 or 30 years down the track, you're probably dead because you've developed cardiovascular disease or some other chronic medical condition, or suicide, of course. But the physical health of patients is terrible. It's worse than our indigenous population in Australia, and it's this terrible neglect of the physical care of the patient. And you have a huge preventive opportunity by looking after them properly in a physical way from the beginning of the illness. And that isn't just to blame the drugs for metabolic syndrome. There's lots of other factors which we can help them with. And this is another big international focus around the early psychosis movement. And finally, e-health, building in technology-based, I shouldn't have to say this in San Francisco, but technology is absolutely incredibly vital complement to what we're doing. And we have colleagues, Mario Alvarez, developing online versions of everything that we do, linked in a social networking sort of strategy for the patients, so that to complement what they're receiving face-to-face. And I know they're doing that at UC Davis, because I saw some of that presented yesterday. Okay, so there are kind of other parts of the world which haven't kind of come online yet with early intervention, but Chile, people from Chile attended the Milan meeting, people from Brazil are active now too, so we're hoping that Latin America will actually get much more heavily involved too. Okay, so we've been doing this early intervention thing for for quite a long time, and what is the next big thing? Well, the next big thing is early intervention for everything, and the International Early Psychosis Association has changed its name to Early Intervention in Mental Health, We have a journal, which is Early Intervention Psychiatry. So it's promoting it across the diagnostic spectrum, and I think the time is right for that, with things like RDoC and just the way we're starting to think and not really believe in these traditional diagnoses as hard entities in the way that we have in the past. So we've got a choice here. This is a cartoon from the Melbourne newspaper. Andrew might recognise this cartoonist, Lunug, very famous cartoonist, and the pathos of life. Yeah, I'll skip it. So in England, they're trying to hold the line on just early psychosis, and they're trying to extend the early intervention programs across the lifespan, not linking it to youth. And we think that's probably a mistake, because there are still problems with some of these aspects of the paradigm, the falling transition rate in UHR, the fact there are multiple exit syndromes. There are some later onset psychosis in first episode, and we've seen reform go backwards in the UK. We've seen some of those UK reforms, which were quite dramatic, get eroded a bit, because it's not a strong enough thing in itself to just sustain. So we're thinking, how can this be made future-proofed? And the youth mental health thing is the thing that we decided about 15 years ago was the thing that was going to future-proof it. And a bunch of the people that have been involved in early psychosis have been shifting their focus, not leaving psychosis behind, but trying to apply these lessons in a different way with new colleagues to other disorders. I mentioned the journal. It's been around for 10 years now. I think it's been a great venue for new researchers in other diagnostic areas other than psychosis. We've got a lot more buy-in from that now. I'm going to skip over this because of time, but we do have to have a new diagnostic approach. I mean, the controversy about DSM-5 was partly right. I mean, it's not to say we can't, that we can not operate with DSM-5. We're not saying we have to get rid of it, but we have to have something else that's going to support early intervention and a more approach to diagnosis with utility, because most of the DSM diagnoses don't really help you with treatment selection. Our treatments in psychiatry are very non-specific. Every drug we have goes across diagnostic boundaries. Every psychosocial treatment we have goes across diagnostic boundaries a la DSM. So what is the point of having a diagnosis if it doesn't help you with treatment selection? So what is the way to fix that? Well, we wrote a paper with Jim Van Os about it, but in America they've tried to fix it with the RDoC criteria, but that's trying to fix it from a research point of view. That's trying to say the current diagnostic categories are not helping us progress knowledge in research, so we need a new approach to that. But that's not much use for clinicians. It's a dimensional thing, and it can't actually be used in the clinic as far as I can see, and they kind of acknowledge that wasn't meant to do that. But we think you can get the best of both worlds through this model of clinical staging. And this is a heuristic idea. It's definitely not ready for use in a practical sense, but it does fit in with these other directions people want to go in. So what is clinical staging? Well, you can see a sort of rough form of it in Jim Van Os's diagram here, where you get the kind of stage 0 people over on the right who don't really have a disorder. They might have a bit of vulnerability, but they've got no symptoms really. And you're moving to the left, and you're starting to get perhaps an early clinical phenotype, and then on the left, far left, you have got the full phenotype of psychosis. But that again is looking at it within the diagnostic silo of schizophrenia and psychosis. We think that the real world is more like this, and certainly from seeing hundreds and hundreds of patients in headspace centres, they have not read the textbooks at all. They come in with microphenotypes of different things, and it's very, very fluid. And I guess people have known that for some time, but certainly at the onset of an illness, knowing that it's kind of very fluid and a bit unpredictable is something that we've definitely learned. And the traditional terms that we use, like schizophrenia, the way we organise our research programs and our societies, schizophrenia, bipolar, my friend Ian Hickey refers to the schizophreniologists and the bipolarists as though they're some kind of sects of various kinds, but they're definitely separated from each other. And they're late-stage phenotypes. Schizophrenia is a late phenotype. By the time you attract that diagnosis, you will have been in trouble for many years, and at least months, but usually years. And bipolar, by the time you attract the bipolar diagnosis, it's often 10 years from the literature that you've actually had symptoms and other sort of syndromes appearing. So it's not very helpful if you're trying to do early intervention, trying to identify early bipolar or early schizophrenia. You've got to actually identify people with a need for care, where they've got symptoms and distress and functional impairment, and then study it prospectively from that point. And that can help you to structure clinical trials and trying to reduce the risk of progression to more extended or elaborated phenotypes. And it can also help you with biomarker studies, which I'll come back to in a minute. So we've written a lot of propaganda about this in various journals, trying to get people to think along these lines and at least test it out. And at least get a debate going about it. And there have been some good debates. And I think Jim Van Oss wrote a very nice paper in the American Journal on subthreshold psychopathology too, which is relevant. And this is what we really see, this sort of thing, in a 13-year-old coming into a headspace centre with some symptoms like maybe insomnia and worrying, and how do those symptoms then evolve? How do they create a risk for further symptoms? And if we had enough fine-grained data on this, we could probably map it. There are definitely mathematical models now, like network analysis, for example. If we have serial data, rich serial data over a period of time, we can actually see how these symptom clusters do evolve. And our kind of boring 19th century rating scales are not going to be up to the task. It's got to be something much more technology-driven, I think, for us to be able to do this. And so that's why we're very interested in talking to Tom Insel and the Verily people about these sorts of things, which we did yesterday. And then the transitions, as we call them, might not be just a linear progression into psychosis or depression. They might be, people might actually make these transitions more suddenly. And there are hints from the old phenomenologists about how this used to occur, from Jaspers and Conrad and these sort of people. And some of the fields like oceanography and geography, that some of my much smarter colleagues back in Melbourne are looking at, might be ways we could actually sort of map that. Barnaby Nelson and Jessica Hartman. And with the biomarkers, we tried to review biomarkers, cross-diagnostically, but it was very, very difficult because all the work had been done within the silos. And there are huge gaps here, especially in the early stages. But the point being that the biomarkers we look at, whether they're inflammation or oxidative stress or whatever, the lipid disturbances, they may be much more sensitive to stage of illness rather than actual syndrome. So trying to link them to schizophrenia or bipolar, there might be some specificity there, but there might also be some specificity for the timing and the evolution of the illness. And that might guide treatment too. So if you've got too much inflammation at the beginning and it kind of settles down later, anti-inflammatories, if they're ever going to be useful, might be useful at a particular stage of illness. So that's how this idea might actually work. And it's all very speculative, I know, but we're trying to do studies that test these hypotheses. My friend Ian Hickey in Sydney is using it, the staging idea, as a sort of a treatment decision step, and that's also sort of seems to be producing better outcomes with that sort of, with a stepping up as the person stage increases, stepping up the treatment. So if we're trying to pursue this elusive, personalised, precision medicine sort of approach, there are obviously new analytic techniques that we can use. There are novel biotherapies that we can test out. Psychotherapies and modernising them with virtual reality and other technologies, internet-based. It's good to think that, we're lucky in psychiatry because it's the one area where we can personalise the therapy to every individual, because every individual is a different person. And that is one of the beauties of psychiatry, that you can actually make the therapy very personal in that way without having any biomarkers. So we can personalise it on two levels, hopefully. And the final thing is that it shouldn't all be CBT. We've got to actually come up with some novel therapies, because a lot of young people don't really like CBT very much, or DBT, or anything else. And they do actually like some of these more expressive ways of working. And we've been very dismissive of those, and we haven't really tried to test them or integrate them. So there's a very nice quote from a patient down the bottom. You see, therapy is like trying to find a shoe that fits, because if it doesn't, you won't be able to take those 2 steps forward. And that's the way they feel. Listening to the young people is very important. And the technologies. This is Tom Insel visiting. He spent 5 weeks in Australia recently. That's our health minister on his right and our prime minister on his left. And our prime minister is a complete technology junkie. He just loves all this stuff. He tweets all the time, and he's very interested in the application of new technologies in mental health. He uses the term mental wealth a lot, meaning it's worth investing in mental health care because you're going to get a return on investment. We've just got to make sure the Treasurer gives him enough money to support this, but we've got an ally there. And that's Ian Hickey, a colleague of ours on the second from the left. So, what we have been trying to do, if we want to progress early intervention with these kind of conceptual building blocks and with the prototype of early psychosis behind us and with us, youth mental health is the focus that we've picked. And this was a declaration written by young people when we set up the International Association for Youth Mental Health about 6 years ago. That association has held 3 international conferences. The next one will be in Dublin next year. But why youth mental health? Well, first of all, as you know, 75% of mental disorders will appear by the age of 25. And 50% of young people will have a significant period of poor mental health during the transition to adulthood. And that's not just teenage angst, that's diagnosable disorder level stuff. The Great Smoky Mountain study in the US shows this, and numerous studies from other parts of the world as well. So it's a thing. It's a thing. And even though it might be a temporary thing in probably a third or maybe even a half, they can die during that period. So just burying your head in the sand and saying it's normal, it's the human condition, it's teenage angst, very irresponsible thing to do. And it doesn't mean we need to over-treat them all and give them all drugs and make them see psychiatrists, but we've got to do something to help them. And the key thing is the pattern of incidence. This is the burden of disease slide. The pattern of incidence for mental disorders is the mirror image of what you see for physical disorders. So, in younger children you've got a nasty cluster of physical diseases, and in the over 50s it's the same. But in the middle productive years of life, and particularly from puberty through to the mid-20s, there's this big surge of mental ill health and substance use and personality disorders and all of these things mixed in together, which result in about 50 to 60% of the burden of disease in that age group. And yet we have designed a health system, you've got one across the road there, which is organised as if this was not the case. You've got a paediatric and adult model. So we have this in Australia. We have a system that's incredibly weak in the teenage and late teenage and early adult period. It's almost impossible to get quality care during that period of life for most of these young people. If you've got kids in that age group and they have problems, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about here, unless you're very lucky. And yet, as the Prime Minister was saying, mental wealth, this is the human capital slide. It's built up very painstakingly from childhood until the person's ready to go. They finish college, they're ready to work, they're ready to contribute, produce, have kids, contribute to society, pay taxes, not be on welfare. And if they die from suicide or they become disabled and can't pay taxes or need welfare support, it's a human and a financial disaster. And you can add numbers to this. They're huge numbers. The Lancet published a special issue on this, more broadly actually on adolescent health. Again, the 10 to 24 age group, we talk about 12 to 25, but they were talking about 10 to 24, which is the UN definition of young people. And, the interesting quote here is not from Ban Ki-moon, but from Melinda Gates, she zeroed in on exactly the problem, that even though the young people are this incredible resource, the systems of care are geared for children and adults, like I was saying. We don't look after them. And there's just more data from that paper. And it isn't, we had Alan Francis, your American friend here in California, touring Australia, saying that we're just labelling people, normal people, and we're just pathologizing, just the human condition. But actually, if you look at what happens to these kids in real life, you follow them up at age 30, there's a direct relationship, dose response between how much mental ill health they had in the transition and how they are doing at age 30 in terms of vocational achievement, in terms of salary earnings, in terms of social relationships. So it's not a theoretical, ideological thing, it's a real thing for those kids. And hardly any of these kids got treatment. So we're so far away from over-treatment, it's not funny. We've got these nice messages going out there, about early intervention, but it's not really backed up by reality. Because in Australia back in 2008, we did this National Mental Health Survey. Only 13% of young men with a diagnosable mental disorder and 31% of young women accessed any type of professional care. And that included general practitioners, school counsellors and so on. It wasn't seeing psychiatrists or specialists, it was seeing anybody. So this is kind of incredible, and that's mobilised our country actually, and we've moved away from this situation to some degree where all the ambulances are at the bottom of the cliff, in emergency departments and acute units, to this new architecture. And what it is, it's building a system of care in between the paediatric one and the adult one, because those late teenagers and the young adults are of very little interest to either CAMS, the child and adolescent, or to the adult psychiatry. And the main business of adult psychiatry kicks in about 30, 35, because that's the more chronic, long-term patient. And the child psychiatry has been so under-resourced. I went to the International Child and Adolescent Psychiatry meeting in Calgary in September, and I was kind of shocked at how threadbare the kind of coverage was in so many countries for child and adolescent. And it's really... there are obviously other major issues and gaps to fill too. But anyway, so we decided to go for a primary care model, so as a first thing, because in our catchment area in Melbourne we had a youth mental health service called Orygen, which treated maybe 700 or 800 young people a year. The catchment area was 1 million people. The National Mental Health Survey told us there were 50,000 young people every year who needed some kind of mental health intervention, and we were seeing 800. And so where were the rest going? Mostly nowhere, because the primary care was so poorly designed and inaccessible for them. So we built something called Headspace, and I'm just going to show you a quick video, if it will work, to give you a sense of what a Headspace is like. It's a one-stop shop. It's a primary care structure as a portal into more specialist care.
Sally is 12. She gets really anxious and worried about going to school. Sally's mum doesn't know what to do anymore. Jacob is 16. He spends all night gaming to help him escape, but he's not sure that's working anymore. He argues a lot with his family and stays out all night with his mates. Dylan is 21. He's been going through a breakup. He's been feeling down for some time, and his friends are really starting to worry. Sally's mum heard about Headspace Craigieburn on TV and gave them a call. The staff at Headspace were friendly and helpful and arranged a time to meet them for a chat. Jacob discovered Headspace Craigieburn online. He wanted to talk to someone who works with and understands young people. One of Dylan's friends told him about Headspace on Facebook, so he checked them out. He wasn't sure at first, but decided to give them a go. When you arrive, you can tell us a bit about yourself and fill out a simple iPad survey. This helps us link you with the right person. That might be a counsellor, GP, drug and alcohol worker, or an education or employment specialist. All in might choose to join a group where you can meet other young people that are in the same boat as you. With the right support and care, Headspace can help young people and their families manage the normal ups and downs of life. Headspace Craigieburn provides support to young people aged between 12 and 25 and their families. We are situated at Craigieburn Central Shopping Centre. If you're unsure how to find us, visit our website for more information, or jump on eHeadspace for online mental health support.
So basically, every Headspace has to have what's called a virtual tour, which they put on YouTube, and so young people can actually they put on the Headspace website, and young people can see what it's really like in their local service before they actually turn up. And they can also access it via eHeadspace as an online direct interaction with a therapist online, which is available as well. So there are 4 basic elements to it. First of all is the youth-friendly interface, like a youth cafe style decor and all of that. GPs, allied health, mainly psychologists, youth workers, vocational workers, so people helping them return to education or employment or stay with it. And finally, drug and alcohol. Now, not all those elements are available in every Headspace because of workforce issues, but that's the basic template of what it's supposed to be. It's in 95 sites across Australia now. It'll be in 110 by the end of next year. The Prime Minister just promised another 10 sites at the last election. So it's probably about 55–60% coverage of the land mass of Australia now in terms of communities covered. So there's still places where it isn't easily accessible, but what it has done politically is if your community doesn't have a Headspace and the town down the road does, creates tremendous pressure on that politician to actually get one for his community, and that's the way it's actually worked. It's been in a series of waves of rollouts over the last 10 years. It's been going for 10 years. If you want to read about it, there are several papers. This is probably the easiest in the Lancet Psychiatry a year or 2 ago. There's been a national evaluation of it. It shows what kind of problems present, and as you can see, you don't have to have a DSM-5 number to actually get access. It's primary care. You can just go and talk to. You're allowed in without anyone grilling you about triage or anything like that. And some of the problems are physical health, sexual health, so it's holistic. It's not just mental health, even though I would say 70% plus of the presentations are mental health related. And drug and alcohol as well. Early stage, we are accessing the young people at an early stage of whatever mental health problem they do have. There is a subgroup of I'd say about a quarter to a third who have got problems that are too complex for primary care, and that's good in a way. We've allowed them into the front room of the house. The problem is our governments have not built the back room of the house yet, so there's a bottleneck then getting them into specialist care. But at least they're visible. And before they were just hidden out there, and they would present late in the emergency department with the problem. So it's kind of a political reform. We're reforming it in steps. And so the outcome data is mixed. It is generally positive in terms of reduced distress and improved functioning, but there is this subgroup that probably are not recovering as well as we'd like because it needs a more intensive specialised model. For example, severe borderline, anorexia, psychosis, complex mood disorders, we can't deal with that just with a GP and a psychologist. And in some headspaces there's a sessional psychiatrist, so I work sessionally in several headspaces, and it's just a fantastic way to work in this flexible primary care way without all the red tape and all the medical legal nonsense you have to worry about in specialist care. It's very, very flexible and dynamic, and the young people help us. They're our consultants. There's a large group attached to each youth mental health, each Headspace centre, who are our advisors, and they help us with the whole problem. The specialist bits are missing. I'm just winding up now, but as well as grassroots support from the community that I alluded to for this sort of reform, we have also been able to engage the top level of government, and I don't mean health ministers or, health departments. I mean the absolute leadership of the country. So this is Kevin Rudd, our Prime Minister in 2010. We're like Italy, we change them every 6 months, and so they're very fragile. Julia Gillard was the next one in 2011. She announced a big injection of new funding, $2 billion for mental health across Australia at the same venue, Sunshine Venue. Then we have Tony Abbott, and Malcolm Turnbull. These are the more conservative Prime Ministers, but both of them have backed Headspace as well. So it's a bipartisan thing. It's not something that's vulnerable to change of government, which is good. In Ireland, the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach there, opening one of the jigsaw services, very similar to Headspace, in Galway in 2009. There are now 13 of these services across the country, and the Irish government's picked up the funding for it in a much more strong way. Same in Denmark. Last week they announced that the Danish government is going to fund the Danish headspaces, which are 9 in number already. So what happens is often philanthropy kicks it off, and then the government picks it up, and that's been a good pattern so far. The Netherlands is very seriously looking at this model as well. So is California. There are some sites, we had some great discussions yesterday. We're very hopeful that it'll be happening here too. Linking with early psychosis. In Canada, there's been tremendous support from philanthropists there. The Graham Beck Foundation have funded this $25 million research program in youth mental health, and at the same time they've been supporting provincial investments in new sites, like this is in Ontario, and there are 4 sites in British Columbia as well. And in Toronto, this is the same sort of model in Toronto. In Europe, youth mental health is starting to grow out of child psychiatry, I guess you could say. This was a bunch of child psychiatrists that came together in 2014, thinking they were talking about children, and leaving, realising they meant young people, not just children. So that was a very good step, because this kind of rigidity about this age of 18 is the thing we've got to beat. As you can see, Headspace is 12 to 25, and that's the group, and obviously the under 12s need help too, so we can link that together, but we've got to look after those emerging adults, because they are very, very precious. So if you want some excitement, come to Dublin next September. This is going to be awesome. The meeting in Ontario was incredibly great. It was that was last year. 200 of the 600 participants were young in the age group. Some of them had lived experience of mental illness, but some of them didn't. They just want to be there and support and be involved. And their voice, they co-chair the sessions, they co-convene the conference. So you have researchers, clinicians, teachers, police, young people. It's just a really great combination of things. And policymakers, we had the Quebec Minister for Health attending as well last time. So, and the Irish government will be front and centre behind this too. So Ireland's not far from America, so there's no real excuse. So just finally, if we're thinking about the next stage for early intervention, obviously there are 25% of people who have onsets after 25, but there must be other ways of looking after. They're in better shape, most of those people. Their lives are already established, and it's not such a developmentally sensitive sort of thing. So we can achieve most of early intervention if we focus on children, and particularly on emerging adults. If you do that, because it's the one thing we haven't been able to do in psychiatry, mobilise political support. NAMI has done its best, but if you just focus on the most seriously ill group of patients, it's not a big enough number to get traction in the way that we're talking about here. But if you focus in this transdiagnostic broad way, including the potentially seriously mentally ill, you will get a lot more support from the public, from the voters, and from the politicians themselves to get investment and reform. That's been our experience, and we're seeing it in other countries as well. It's the best buy in healthcare, investing in these young people, absolutely the best buy. I mean, we invest vast amounts of money in cancer, and we get instructed to produce cost-effectiveness data to justify our case in mental health. If the cancer people had to justify cost-effectiveness, they'd be a complete failure, because it is not cost-effective to do what we're doing in cancer. Obviously, it's a humane thing to do. We want to do it because our grandmother's got cancer, or we might get cancer. It's an emotional and caring thing to do, like any civilized society would do. So I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying, you know, we shouldn't have to be held to this cost-effectiveness standard. But if we are, we can nail it, because it's a very cost-effective thing to do compared to any other area of healthcare. And we've got really good evidence from psychosis to show that. If you just stick to this niche approach, though, in one set of disorders, like developing a little early intervention for bipolar, early intervention for depression, not joined up, it won't work. You know, I think we've got to be too big to fail here. We've got to have a system that focuses on people, so it's inclusive and it's too big to fail. And there have been attempts to kind of attack the headspace reform in Australia, but because it's got so much popular support and increasing evidence, it is in that situation now. It's pretty much untouchable. It's going to keep progressing, and it's going to keep being guided by evidence. So evidence-based, that's the best insurance policy to make sure that you're doing the right thing, because otherwise you could go off on blind alleys and wrong tracks if you didn't actually have the science and the research guiding it as well. And the big challenge we have, just the final thing, is how do we specialise? How do we get more expertise? The front end, the primary care front end, is fantastic. It's stigma-free. The young people are very comfortable walking into it. It's not in a clinic. It's not in a stigmatised setting. So you can get them in the door, into the front room, the foyer and the front room. And then how do we get the specialists into the back room? How do we get access to more specialised teams and more intensive care via this portal? And we haven't really solved that, and it's a big challenge, and every health system has to do it a different way, I guess, because your health system's extremely complex. You know, I only understood about half of what was discussed in the meeting yesterday, but it's very complex. But the needs are the same, so it's really up to us to kind of construct this in a way that works. And many of you will be researchers. This is an amazing opportunity for research. You get to see young people at a stage of illness that they've never been seen before at, and can be studied and followed, and you can try different treatments and approaches, and just having the access to them before they're really way down the track is very, very, very precious for research as well. So I'll just I want to stop by acknowledging my friends and colleagues. I couldn't fit everyone on the slide, unfortunately, because as you can imagine, with this sort of global thing, there's hundreds and hundreds of people involved in this work. So, but they all deserve a lot of credit. And thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much for that report. Any questions?
Thank you so much for this wonderful, thoughtful, and enlightening talk. I'm going to provide a little bit of context before I ask my question. It's really about a community buy-in, which you mentioned again. I just gave a training to community clinicians on how to integrate family interventions for an early psychosis program. And the resounding feedback that I got from clinicians was, this is a highly stigmatizing approach. And I have some witnesses here. Highly stigmatizing approach because we're using a medical model language to approach the population. And the clinicians, there's about 20, 25 clinicians, were very reluctant to use the word illness in their language. And I get the other side of the argument in terms of mental wealth versus mental illness, or mental health versus illness. But they were very sensitive to the potential stigmatizing effects of using medical-derived language to understanding the problems, both health medical health, physiological health, mind health problems that folks who are in the early stages of psychosis face. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Interesting.
How do we talk about that and get community buy-in without alienating community members?
So who was worried about was it the families were worried about the stigmatizing language, or?
No, the clinicians.
Yeah, the clinicians are always the problem.
Thank you.
I mean, in the sense that, I don't know, I mean, what I mean by that is to try to get them to look at things in a different way. And, I mean, even we couldn't have set up something like Headspace without the young people, you know. It's different because they had a voice and they had an influence over the way the thing was done. If we'd left it to the clinicians, it would have been 9 to 5, it would have been, you know, suiting their preferences and what their needs, you know, clinician-centric. So if you want to change things, you've got to actually involve the people that you're helping. And I would say graduates, you know, get some of the people that have been through it and get them to advise and influence, because clinicians can't argue. No one can argue with the expert, who's the patient and the family who've been through it. You know, I mean, that problem of how to do it, it's a genuine problem. What is the right way to sort of to pitch it and present it? I mean, I remember a guy coming to Australia years ago, like 25 years ago, and the first thing he did in a family psychoeducation session was put up a picture of a CAT scan with, you know, most of the brain missing, and said, well, this is biological illness, and this is the brain of someone with schizophrenia, and it just shocked and horrified everybody. So there's an extreme way to do it, but there's a way to do it in recognising the medical and the you know, the medical aspects of it. And I mean, a lot of the evidence is medical, isn't it? And so we've got to find a way to tell the truth, you know, and about it, and empower the families with the knowledge that they need to deal with the problem, and actually help their family member, and for the young person themselves to find a way to think about it, the explanatory model. And you know, so I think another way to soften it, you can show them in a sort of graded exposure sort of way, different levels of information, so it's not threatening stuff first and perhaps more challenging stuff later. But you can also use a strengths-based model. And a guy called Mario Alvarez, who developed our online stuff, he has converted all the interventions, the CBT type things and the vocational things, into online versions. But he's also developed a strength-based way derived from positive psychology at showing much more positive things to the patient and the families, and teaching them how they can actually cope and deal with challenge, and understanding themselves and what their own strengths are. It's incredibly positive and optimistic, as well as you know, you don't want to present all the information in a kind of a pessimistic way, I suppose, you know. So there's definitely we've got written 19 manuals on this stuff, you know, of how to do all of these different things in a way that's optimistic but is reflecting the evidence. And if it's ideological, then you're kind of losing the battle if you're thinking ideology. You've got to think holistically about these things. But yeah, I think there's always going to be resistance, you know, and it's in our service, you know, it's the services go on. I mean, they have to be reinvented, I think, every 5 years. Otherwise, they get institutionalised around the needs of the clinicians. Yeah. Dan, yeah.
Thinking about the replication study of the omega-3.
Yeah.
And the fact that there really isn't any signal there, but that at least the conversion rate seems quite low in both groups.
Yeah.
If I understand your sort of favorite interpretation, it's that our other interventions, largely psychosocial interventions, are working pretty effectively to reduce the transition rates. But my take on some of the meta-analytic reviews, even of the CBT work, even the Vandergag meta-analysis that you cited, but I've also seen a recent review, a meta-analytic Palo, User-Foley, that didn't suggest a very strong effect, in fact not quite significant effect of CBT, at least on transition. So it's a little hard for me to understand how these psychosocial interventions could be so effective as to reduce the transition rate to that low level, but not really show up as quite producing a strong and significant effect in the meta-analytic reviews, which is therefore leading me to alternative hypotheses about what's going on. This then reduces back to a question we've all been asking worldwide, which is why we've seen the transition rates going down across samples that are doing systematic research in this population across the world, and we've seen it in the Naples study. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the possibility that that lower transition rate may be due to something other than the psychosocial intervention.
Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously thought a lot about that. The other possibility is obviously that you're sampling a less enriched group, right? And that is possible, and it's certainly possible the way some centres do sample. I just had to review a paper where they put ads in the paper basically and just sampled any random person who wasn't even help seeking to actually enter the study. So you're definitely going to get a more dilute group that way, you would think, you know. But so it's just hard to think of a way of testing for that to be the case. It's hard to prove that one way or the other, isn't it? That's been the dilemma. I think the other thing is that maybe another possible explanation is you're identifying them earlier in this clinical phenotype, so they haven't had the clinical phenotype for as long, and there is some evidence, in our data for that, but it's not very striking. And the thing against them being less enriched is the fact that they are just as symptomatic, and just as impaired functionally as they ever were back in 20 years ago. So they seem to have something as severe with the same phenotype. Now, I suppose that still doesn't mean that they couldn't be different in terms of intrinsic risk. But I don't actually agree with what you're saying about the value of the psychosocial treatments. I've got obviously a more positive view of what they do, and you could say that you had to do a meta-analysis to show that benefit because several of the trials failed to achieve significance. But that's the point of meta-analysis, to kind of get around the low power problem, isn't it? So it just depends on your faith in meta-analysis to do that, I guess. But I don't know. I think it's still an open question, as your question implied. We don't really know, and we were encouraged by reviewers of this paper to say something more definitive that fish oil doesn't work. But we were kind of a little bit reluctant. And I was never really a big fan of fish oil. I was never really a true believer. I was very sceptical about the first study. I couldn't believe that it was so strong. So I wasn't surprised by the results. But having said that, I think that there are other studies going on, and maybe they will show a more positive result, and maybe there's a subgroup that might benefit. But you're right, it's a big problem for this concept that the transition rate has reduced, and we don't really know why. And our solution to that is, as you can see, to sort of not try to zero in on refining the prediction of psychosis anymore, but actually try to look for a broader sort of phenotype, a broader earlier phenotype which will have a number of different types of outcomes, not just one.
So just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
You may have heard already that we're starting to analyze the Naples omega-3 data.
Yep.
And we didn't have enough transitions in that subsample to be able to look at that outcome, but we're also not seeing any signal in connection with symptom reduction in the omega-3 group relative to the placebo.
Right.
It's just no signal whatsoever.
Oh, okay. Well,
clinical improvement.
Well, in the NeuroPro study, we saw very, very great improvements in both placebo and fish oil over that first 6 months. So the functioning improved greatly, and so did the symptoms, and that's why I think you could say that the other things they got, which included antidepressants, so it was antidepressants and cognitive behaviour case management. So the patients all got better in whichever group they were in. So
Gene Addington showed this even in connection, I think, in the Naples 1 retrospective sample, that the general tendency of these individuals when they enter the study is that they improve over 2 years. Those are the trajectories on average.
Yeah.
Obviously not for those who transition, but
yeah. Except in the Vienna study, the placebo group didn't improve. And this is why we were trying to say, well, in Vienna they hardly got any psychosocial treatment, but in the replication they got a lot more, and even the placebo group improved. So that's the case in favour of what I was saying. But I'm not sure. I mean, you're right. I think it would be good to be able to test the other hypothesis.
The other thing I would just mention, I just saw a talk from Paolo, and I think he's published this now. He's looking at transition rates as a function of the referral source of individuals at risk, and seeing some significant differences based on the referral source. That sort of speaks to this idea that maybe we are getting, for reasons that have less to do with the symptom presentation, but more to other factors that are leading people to seek help in different ways. We're seeing that referrals from schools are not transitioning in the same way that referrals from specialized clinics or inpatient units are, according to his review.
Yeah, that makes sense. Matthew?
So, probably not surprising to ask a question about genetics. So, for the first time, there now is a body of information that's highly reliable about genetic risks. And so one of the things I just wonder about is when you think about enrichment, if you genotype any of these samples and take a look and see whether or not, if you look at high polygenic risk scores, based on the gene discovery data, you got a 10 to 20-fold increase in risk if you're in the top, decile of polygenic risk. But even prior to that, we know that family history is a really strong predictor of whether or not someone's going to be affected. And so I just wonder, when you take a look for enrichment in samples, the question about family history and whether or not that gives you any traction at all, has that been a complete bust in thinking about who?
Yeah, well, we have got DNA from some of these cohorts which we can look at. We did find in a smaller sample, neuregulin was predictive, for example, but family history was one of the 3 sets of criteria that fit into the ultra-high risk criteria.
So they all have family history?
Only there was 3 ways in. One is having subthreshold positive symptoms. One was having blips, like brief bursts but not sustained. And the third group was family history of first-degree relative with a psychotic disorder, plus a deterioration in GAF score. So you're allowed into the sample under 3 sort of banners, any one of 3 banners, and there's a lot of overlap actually between the 3 groups too. So family history hasn't been more predictive, but I wouldn't say it's been less predictive either, from what I can remember. Yeah.
So in our system here, you really struggle with the scalability part of this. And you mentioned in your response to one of the questions just sort of the idea about sort of clinical culture and just sort of the way that clinicians practice. What are your thoughts on if you want to scale an early intervention transdiagnostic program, how do you need to think about reorganizing sort of clinicians to address the needs of this population? Different training, different sort of organizational structure.
Yeah, it's a huge question. I mean, because every health system is different, isn't it? So the creative part of it is in that space. But having a financial model, is key, because the headspace idea was not very original. I mean, people had talked about having a one-stop shop for young people before. Certainly in Australia, but they couldn't finance it because the government funds fee-for-service via national insurance for GPs to see people, and in 2003 they also allowed psychologists to be covered under that, which was a great step forward to make this possible. But you still need the infrastructure cost to rent the premises, to pay the admin staff, to pay the intake staff on a salaried basis. And there are sort of 2 or 3 groups that you want to actually have on salary, and then the others can just come in as providers, you know, and do sessional work in the team. And so it's a hybrid model financially. You know, but because we had the federal government giving us a grant of close to $1 million per centre, that made that possible for the other things to happen, whereas people hadn't been able to do it before. So the financial model is really important, and we had a meeting yesterday with the counties and with the state, and I mean, obviously the HMOs need to be potentially involved in this as well. It's very complex here. We've got multiple payers, and so in a way the work practice of clinicians is only one impediment. I think if you set up the model, if you've got a way of financing it and you've designed it, we use this term minimal viable product, which is taken from the startup literature, you know. So if you design the minimal viable product, whether it was the iPhone or you know, whatever it is, and then people can see it working, then that is a massive sort of first step in scaling things up. But you've got to be able to design it, and then it's really the financing of it, I think, is the thing. You will get the early adopters, that the enthusiastic clinicians that love young people will come and work in it, and then you can try to reform the training of everybody else afterwards. You know. But we're trying to make youth mental health a specialty, you know, a special area. It can be linked to child psychiatry, or but it's got to be linked to adult as well. But you know, and the reform that I've talked about is more primary care than specialist care anyway. But so I mean, there's a number of steps to answering your question, but it takes real genius in terms of the health system and the financing of the health system to make it, you know, to get it to that first step, I think.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry that we'll have to stay for another half an hour at least, but we have to go. Thanks, everyone.